The sound didn't belong in a hospital. It cut through the sterile corridors sharper than the beeping monitors, sharper than the rolling carts, sharp enough that every conversation stopped mid-breath. Emily Carter stood frozen under the harsh fluorescent lights, one hand instinctively cradling her 8-month pregnant belly, the other gripping the edge of a metal railing as if the world had suddenly tilted a few degrees off balance. For a moment, no one moved. Nurses paused with clipboards mid-air. A man in a waiting chair slowly lowered his phone, and somewhere down the hall, a heart monitor kept its steady rhythm like nothing had happened at all. But everything had. David Blackwood adjusted the cuff of his tailored suit as if he had just completed a minor inconvenience, his expression calm, controlled, practiced. To him, this was not a moment, it was a correction. "You're causing a scene," he said quietly, his voice low enough to feel private but sharp enough to carry. Emily blinked, her vision flickering between clarity and blur, the bright white lights above her buzzing faintly, the faint scent of antiseptic mixing with something metallic at the back of her throat. The baby moved, a small, urgent shift beneath her ribs, as if reacting to something she couldn't yet name. She inhaled slowly, carefully, like she had been taught in prenatal class. 4 seconds in, hold, 4 seconds out, but the air felt thinner than it should have been. Behind David, Vanessa stood perfectly still, one hand resting lightly on his arm, her expression composed in that polished, distant way of someone who believed she was already part of the future, and this moment was just something inconvenient to step over. Somewhere, a phone camera tilted upward. Someone whispered. The hospital, a place built for healing, had turned into a stage without warning. 8 minutes, a nurse had said earlier. 8 minutes until they needed to move Emily into emergency evaluation because her blood pressure had spiked beyond what anyone felt comfortable ignoring. 8 minutes that suddenly felt like a countdown no one had prepared her for. Sign the papers, David continued, holding out a folder like it weighed nothing, like it didn't contain the quiet dismantling of everything she had once believed was permanent. Emily looked at it but didn't reach. Her fingers tightened instead around the thin hospital bracelet on her wrist, the plastic edge pressing into her skin, grounding her in something real. Her last name, Carter, printed in black ink, simple, unremarkable, forgotten by almost everyone except the system that recorded her existence. At the far end of the corridor, a set of double doors opened with a soft mechanical sigh, and a man in a white coat stepped through, scanning a chart as he walked. Dr. Michael Carter moved with the calm precision of someone who had spent decades making decisions that balanced on the edge of life and time, his presence steady, unshaken. But then he slowed. Not all at once, just enough to notice. His eyes lifted, drawn not by the tension in the air but by something quieter, something almost invisible. A detail. A name. A face. Emily shifted slightly, her bracelet catching the light for half a second. And in that second, something in him paused, not fully understood, not yet spoken, just a flicker of recognition that didn't belong to logic. The hallway held its breath again, not because of what had already happened, but because something unseen had just begun. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured in small pieces, a whisper here, a shifting step there, the soft hum of machines suddenly too loud against the tension pressing in from every direction as Emily's fingers trembled against the cold metal railing and she focused on staying upright, on staying present, on keeping her breathing steady enough that the life inside her would not feel her fear amplify into something worse. Because fear had a way of traveling through her now, through blood and pulse and fragile connection, and she could not afford that, not with 8 minutes already slipping away, not with the weight in her chest tightening with every second that passed, while David exhaled slowly like a man waiting out an inconvenience, his patience thinning not from concern but from irritation that the situation was not resolving on his terms. "I am not asking again," he said, extending the folder closer, the edge of the paper catching the overhead light, clean, sharp. "Final. Sign it and we are done." And for a brief moment Emily saw it not as paper but as a line being drawn across everything she had built, everything she had believed had meaning, her name attached to his, her life folded neatly into his world, now being erased with the same controlled ease he used to close deals and end conversations, and behind him Vanessa shifted slightly, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, the sound precise, deliberate, like punctuation to a sentence that was already decided. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she added, her tone calm but edged with something colder, something that did not need to raise its volume to carry weight, and somewhere to the left a nurse stepped forward hesitantly, her training pulling her toward intervention but her uncertainty holding her back, because this was not a medical emergency yet, not officially, just a moment suspended between personal conflict and clinical urgency. And that space was where things often went unseen, where damage could happen quietly, without protocol, without report, while at the far end of the corridor Dr. Michael Carter slowed further, the chart in his hand lowering slightly as his attention shifted fully now, not to the voices, not to the tension, but to the detail that refused to settle into the background. Carter, the name repeating in his mind with a faint echo that did not match the present, and then the bracelet again, the way the light hit it, the way her hand held it as if it mattered more than the situation unfolding around her, and something in his memory stirred, not a clear image, not yet, just a fragment, a hospital room years ago, a child with no records, a case that had never closed cleanly, and he inhaled once, steady, measured, grounding himself in the present even as that fragment refused to disappear, while Emily's knees softened for just a second, not enough to fall, just enough that she had to shift her weight, her palm pressing more firmly against her abdomen as a wave of pressure moved through her, unfamiliar, tightening, and she closed her eyes briefly, counting again, forcing her body to follow rhythm instead of panic. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold, release, the way they had taught her, the way she had practiced alone in quiet rooms that never felt this loud, and when she opened her eyes David was still there, unchanged, unmoved, waiting, as if time belonged to him, as if the countdown did not apply, as if nothing in this moment could truly disrupt the path he had already chosen, but somewhere just behind that certainty, unseen by him, unnoticed by Vanessa, something had already begun to shift, subtle, silent, but irreversible, like the first crack in glass before it spreads across the entire surface. The pressure did not fade, it gathered, slow and deliberate, tightening around Emily's ribs like an invisible band that refused to loosen, and she swallowed carefully, trying to keep her breath even while the edges of the hallway seemed to sharpen and blur at the same time, every sound stretching just a fraction too long, every second carrying more weight than the last, and somewhere close by a monitor let out a steady, mechanical tone that reminded her exactly where she was and exactly what was at risk, while David shifted his stance, impatience now visible in the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle glance at his watch, the quiet calculation of a man who measured time and outcomes rather than moments. "You are running out of options," he said, his voice still controlled but no longer calm, as if the script he had written for this encounter was beginning to drift off course, and Emily's fingers loosened slightly from the railing, not in surrender but in something else. Something quieter, a realization that settled beneath the fear, because options implied choice, and for the first time since he handed her the folder, she understood that the choice he was offering was not the only one that existed, not here, not now, not with witnesses who had stopped pretending not to see, not with the air itself holding tension like a held breath, and Vanessa's expression flickered for just a second, the smallest crease between confidence and irritation as she noticed the shift, the way people were no longer looking away but looking directly, openly, the phones no longer hidden but steady, recording, preserving, turning a private demand into something public and undeniable, and that was when Dr. Michael Carter stepped closer, not abruptly, not dramatically, just one measured step that placed him within the edge of the moment, his gaze moving from the folder to Emily's face. Then to the bracelet again, the name clear now, Carter, and something aligned in his mind. With a quiet but undeniable click, a timeline, a case file, a memory that had never fully closed, and he spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of authority that did not need volume. "She needs to be evaluated. Immediately." And the words shifted the air, redirecting it, because they carried protocol, responsibility, and something deeper that even he had not fully named yet, while the nurse who had hesitated before stepped forward with renewed certainty, grateful for a directive that anchored her role. "We need to move now," she said, reaching gently toward Emily, And Emily nodded faintly, her body responding before her mind could process, because the pressure had returned stronger this time, a wave that demanded attention, that reminded her that the countdown was real, that 8 minutes did not pause for conflict or control, and David exhaled sharply, the sound low but edged with frustration. "This is not over," he said, his eyes locking onto hers as if trying to pull her back into his version of the moment, but something had already shifted too far for that to hold, because as Emily allowed herself to be guided forward, one careful step at a time, her hands still resting protectively against her abdomen, she did not look back at him, not this time, and that absence of reaction, that quiet refusal to engage, landed heavier than anything she could have said, while behind her Dr. Carter remained still for a fraction longer, watching, calculating, the name echoing again in his mind, not as coincidence anymore but as a question demanding an answer, and as the doors ahead began to open. The corridor behind did not return to normal, it remained altered, charged, because everyone who had witnessed the moment understood something without needing it explained, that whatever had just started was not going to end quietly. The doors did not close behind her immediately, they hovered for a second longer than usual, as if the hospital itself hesitated to separate what had just happened from what was about to unfold, and Emily felt the subtle shift in temperature as she was guided into the evaluation room, the air cooler, cleaner, quieter, but not calmer, because the tension followed her in, settling just beneath her skin, threading through every breath she tried to steady, while the nurse adjusted the bed with efficient movements, raising it slightly, positioning her carefully, speaking in a tone that was professional but softened by something human. "We are going to take care of you, just focus on your breathing." And Emily nodded faintly, her hands still anchored over her abdomen as another wave passed through, stronger now, more defined, no longer just discomfort but something with rhythm, something that made the countdown feel real in a way words never could, and the monitor beside her flickered to life, numbers appearing, rising, shifting, translating her body into data that others could read, while she could only feel the weight of it, the pressure, the urgency, the quiet fear she refused to let fully surface. Because fear would not help her now, not here, not when. Everything depended on control, on staying present, on holding herself together 1 second at a time. And just outside the room the corridor had not settled, voices had lowered but not disappeared, the energy still charged, still watching, while David remained where he was, the folder now lowered slightly at his side, his expression harder, less composed, because the moment had slipped from his control and he could feel it. Even if he did not yet understand how far it had gone, and Vanessa leaned closer, her voice barely audible, a whisper meant only for him, but the tension in her posture betrayed the same awareness, that something had shifted in a way they had not planned, not anticipated, not accounted for, while down the hall Dr. Michael Carter stood still for just a fraction longer before turning, his pace measured but purposeful now, the chart in his hand forgotten, replaced by something else entirely. Something older, something unresolved, and as he approached the room his mind moved through fragments, dates, faces, records that had never aligned properly, a case that had ended without closure, a child listed without family, a name that had stayed in the system but never found its place, and now here it was again, not as a file but as a person, as a presence, as a possibility that refused to be coincidence, and he paused at the doorway, not entering yet, just observing. His eyes moving to the bracelet once more, confirming what he had already begun to suspect. While inside the nurse spoke again, gently but firmly. "We are going to run a few quick checks. Everything we do now is to make sure you and your baby are safe." And Emily's eyes closed briefly, not in surrender but in focus, gathering what strength she had left, because safety was no longer something she assumed, it was something she had to fight for, quietly, steadily, without noise, and as the machine recorded her heartbeat and another smaller rhythm beneath it, Dr. Carter finally stepped inside, the room shifting again in a way no one could quite name yet, because sometimes the most important changes did not arrive with sound or force, they arrived with recognition, with a single truth moving into place, silent, undeniable, and impossible to undo. The room settled into a rhythm that felt controlled on the surface but carried urgency underneath, the soft beeping of the monitor marking time in precise intervals while Emily focused on matching her breath to it, in through her nose, slow and measured, out through her mouth, steady and deliberate, each cycle an effort to stay anchored as the pressure returned again, stronger now, more insistent. And she tightened her grip on the thin hospital sheet beneath her fingers, grounding herself in something physical, something real, while the nurse adjusted a cuff around her arm and glanced at the screen, her expression shifting just slightly, not enough to alarm, but enough to confirm that time was narrowing. "Blood pressure is still elevated," she said quietly, more to the room than to Emily, and then, "Doctor, we may need to move faster." And that was when Dr. Michael Carter stepped closer, his presence calm but focused, his attention no longer divided, his eyes moving carefully over the readings, over Emily, over the bracelet once more, as if each detail mattered equally, as if each one was part of a larger equation he was beginning to solve, and he spoke in a tone that carried both authority and restraint. "Let us stabilize her first, we do this step by step." And Emily turned her head slightly toward his voice, something in it steady enough to hold on to, something that did not demand, did not pressure, did not reduce her to a decision on paper, and for the first time since the corridor, her breathing eased just a fraction, not because the situation had changed, but because the space around her had, and outside the room the tension had not dissolved, it had shifted direction, because David had not left, he stood just beyond the doorway now, his presence pressing against the boundary of the room like a force that refused to be excluded. "I need to speak with my wife," he said, his voice controlled but edged, as if the word wife still granted him authority over what happened inside, and the nurse hesitated, glancing toward Dr. Carter, waiting for direction, and there was a brief pause, a moment where protocol and instinct aligned, and Dr. Carter did not look at David immediately, he looked at Emily, at the way her hand remained over her abdomen, at the way her body responded to each wave with quiet determination, and then he turned, his gaze meeting David's with a calm that did not yield. "Right now she is my patient," he said evenly, "and her condition takes priority." And the words were simple, but they landed with a weight that shifted the balance in the room, because authority had just changed hands not through force, but through responsibility, and David's expression tightened, the first clear sign that something was no longer aligning with his expectations, while Vanessa remained just behind him, her silence more calculated now, her eyes moving quickly, assessing, recalculating, and inside the room Emily felt another movement, stronger, deeper, and she closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to center herself, because everything was narrowing to this moment, to this space, to this fight she had not chosen but could no longer avoid, and as Dr. Carter reached for her wrist to check her pulse, his fingers paused for just a fraction of a second against the bracelet. The name clear beneath his touch, Carter, and something within him settled into place, not fully revealed, not spoken, but undeniable, like a truth that had been waiting long enough and had finally found its moment to surface. The contact lingered for a fraction longer than necessary, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for Dr. Carter to feel the quiet certainty settle beneath his fingertips as he released Emily's wrist and straightened, his expression unchanged on the surface while something deeper aligned beneath it, a pattern forming from fragments that had never quite connected until now, and he turned slightly toward the nurse, his voice calm but carrying new precision. "I want a full panel and continuous monitoring, and prepare for possible early delivery if her numbers do not stabilize within the next few minutes." And the nurse nodded immediately, moving with renewed urgency, her earlier hesitation replaced by clarity, because direction had solidified into command, while Emily focused on the sound of his voice again, the steadiness of it cutting through the rising pressure that rolled through her body in waves, each one stronger than the last, each one pulling her further into a moment she could no longer delay, and she pressed her lips together, breathing through it, counting again, holding on to rhythm as the only thing she could control, while outside the room David shifted his weight, the distance between him and the doorway now feeling less like a boundary and more like a barrier he could not cross, and that realization sharpened his tone. "You are overstepping," he said, louder now, not shouting but no longer contained, the words directed at Dr. Carter with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. "I have the legal authority here." And for a brief second the room seemed to pause, the kind of pause where outcomes could shift depending on what came next, and Dr. Carter turned fully this time, meeting David's gaze without any visible reaction, without challenge, without concession, just a level, unwavering focus that did not recognize the claim being made. "Not in this room," he replied, his voice even, controlled, final, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than argument, because it did not invite negotiation, it closed it, and David's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in the control he had maintained, while Vanessa's posture changed subtly beside him, her hand lowering from his arm, her attention shifting, because she understood something instinctively that he had not yet accepted, that influence did not operate the same way here, not under fluorescent lights, not under medical authority, not when the situation had moved beyond social leverage into something governed by protocol and accountability. And inside the room Emily felt another surge, sharper now, more urgent, and she let out a slow breath she had been holding, her hand gripping the sheet again as her body responded in ways she could not stop, only manage, and the monitor beside her reflected it, numbers adjusting, patterns shifting, translating her experience into signals that filled the space with quiet urgency, while Dr. Carter stepped closer again, his attention returning fully to her, his movements precise, deliberate, and as he reached to adjust the monitor his eyes caught the bracelet once more, not as confirmation now, but as something else entirely. Something that carried weight beyond the present moment, beyond the room, beyond the immediate urgency. And he spoke again, softer this time, not to the room, not to the nurse, but directly to Emily. "Stay with me." And the words were simple, but they held something steady, something grounded, something that did not demand but supported, and for the first time since everything began, Emily nodded without hesitation, because in that moment she understood, without needing explanation, that whatever was happening around her, whatever was shifting beyond her view, she was no longer standing alone inside it. The rhythm in the room tightened, not louder but sharper, as if every sound had been pulled into focus, the steady beeping of the monitor now carrying urgency instead of reassurance, and Emily felt it in her chest before she saw it on the screen, the way her body no longer moved in quiet waves but in deliberate surges that demanded attention, demanded timing, demanded strength she was not sure she still had. And she inhaled again, deeper this time, slower, holding the breath just long enough to steady the trembling in her hands before releasing it, her fingers pressing into the fabric beneath her as if she could anchor herself through sheer will, while Dr. Carter watched the numbers with a level of concentration that left no space for distraction, each shift and pattern registering instantly, each change translating into decision, and he spoke without looking away. "We are approaching a threshold, we need to be ready." And the nurse responded immediately, adjusting equipment, preparing instruments, the room shifting from observation to action in a matter of seconds, while just beyond the doorway David took a step forward, instinct overriding restraint, his voice cutting through again. "This is unnecessary, she is fine." And for the first time there was something else beneath his words, not concern but urgency, not for her condition but for control slipping further away, and Vanessa's hand moved slightly, not to stop him but to steady herself, her eyes scanning the room, calculating, searching for leverage that no longer existed, while inside Emily felt another surge stronger than the last, and this time it pulled a quiet sound from her, not loud, not dramatic, just real, and she closed her eyes briefly, focusing inward, because everything outside her had become noise, and everything inside her had become the only truth that mattered, and when she opened them again, Dr. Carter was there, closer now, his presence steady, his voice low but clear. "Look at me," he said, and she did, not because she was told to, but because there was something in his tone that held, that grounded, that made the moment feel structured instead of chaotic, and he nodded once, as if confirming something beyond what the monitor showed, beyond what the room understood, and for a second his gaze flickered again to the bracelet, the name catching the light. Carter, and the final piece settled into place with quiet certainty, not spoken, not revealed, but undeniable, and he turned to the nurse, his voice shifting just slightly, still calm but carrying a new layer beneath it, something protective, something personal that did not belong to protocol alone. Stay with her, do not leave her side. And the instruction landed differently, not as routine but as priority, and the nurse nodded with immediate understanding, while outside the room the corridor remained still, not empty but suspended, as if everyone who had witnessed the moment understood without words that something larger was unfolding, something that could not be reversed. And as Emily gripped the sheet again, her breathing steady but strained, her focus locked on the present second, the present movement, the present fight, the space around her shifted once more, not with noise, not with force, but with the quiet arrival of truth moving closer to the surface, waiting for the exact moment it could no longer remain hidden. The room moved faster now, not chaotic but precise, every motion intentional, every sound layered with purpose, and Emily felt herself being repositioned slightly as the nurse adjusted the bed, raising it just enough, aligning her body with the process that had already begun whether she was ready or not, and she exhaled slowly, her breath catching for a brief second before she forced it steady again. Because control was no longer optional, it was survival, and the monitor responded in kind, its rhythm tightening, its numbers shifting in a pattern that translated urgency into data, while Dr. Carter stood at her side, his focus absolute, his movements economical, no wasted motion, no hesitation, and yet beneath that clinical precision there was something else now, something that had crossed from observation into protection, subtle but unmistakable, and he spoke again, his voice low but firm. You are doing exactly what you need to do, stay with the rhythm, do not fight it. And Emily nodded faintly, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond him, not seeing the room anymore, not seeing the people, only feeling the sequence unfolding within her, one moment leading to the next, each one demanding presence, demanding strength, while outside the doorway the tension had not dissipated, it had thickened, because David had not stepped back, he remained just beyond the threshold, his presence pressing against the boundary like a force that refused to accept exclusion, and his voice came again, sharper now, stripped of the controlled calm he had carried earlier. This ends now, he said, not to anyone in particular but to the moment itself, as if declaring it could still be contained, still be redirected, and Vanessa's posture stiffened beside him, her silence no longer composed but calculated, her eyes moving quickly between the room and the corridor, sensing the shift in power even if she did not fully understand its source, while a second nurse appeared at the edge of the room, drawn by the urgency in the air, and the space filled with quiet coordination, instruments prepared, positions adjusted, everything aligning toward a single outcome that no longer waited for permission, and inside that alignment Emily felt another surge, deeper, undeniable, and this time she did not try to resist it. She moved with it, her breath sinking, her body responding, and a quiet determination settled in her chest, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, because somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the pressure, beneath the uncertainty, there was a clarity she had not felt before, that this moment belonged to her, not to the voices outside, not to the demands, not to the past that had led her here, but to the life she carried and the choice to protect it. And as Dr. Carter reached again to steady the monitor, his eyes caught the bracelet once more, not as a question. Now, not as suspicion, but as confirmation, the final alignment of a truth that could no longer remain unspoken, and his jaw tightened just slightly, the only visible sign that something within him had shifted beyond protocol, beyond duty, into something personal, something irreversible, and he turned his head just enough to glance toward the doorway, toward David, toward the presence that had dominated the corridor only minutes before, and for the first time there was a difference in the way he looked, not as a doctor addressing a situation, but as a man who understood exactly what was at stake, and exactly what would not be allowed to happen again. The moment stretched, not longer in time but heavier in meaning, as if everything in the room had reached a point where it could no longer remain suspended, and Emily felt it before anyone said a word, the shift from preparation into inevitability, her breath no longer something she controlled but something she followed, each inhale pulled deeper, each exhale slower, more deliberate. Her body guiding her now instead of the other way around, and she tightened her grip again, grounding herself in the only thing that mattered, the rhythm, the movement, the presence of the life she carried, while the monitor beside her reflected the change with sharper precision, its steady pattern now marked with urgency, numbers rising and falling in a sequence that demanded attention, and the nurse glanced at it, then at Dr. Carter, her voice low but clear. "We are there." And he nodded once, the confirmation quiet but absolute, and he stepped closer, his focus narrowing completely, every distraction falling away, because this was the moment everything aligned toward, the point where waiting ended and action began. And yet even in that clarity, even in that precision, his eyes flickered once more to the bracelet, to the name that had now settled into certainty within him, Carter, not coincidence, not similarity, but connection, and the weight of that realization moved through him without disrupting his control. Because control was what the room needed, what Emily needed, what this moment required, and he spoke again, steady, grounded. "You are not alone, do you hear me?" And the words carried something different now, something deeper than reassurance, something that did not belong to procedure, and Emily's eyes opened, finding his, holding there for just a second longer than before, because she felt it too, not the full truth, not yet, but the shift, the presence, the difference between being managed and being protected, and she nodded faintly, her breath catching and then steadying again as another wave moved through her, stronger, undeniable, pulling her fully into the moment she could not step away from, while outside the room. David's patience fractured completely, his voice cutting through the corridor with sharper edge. "This is being handled incorrectly," he said louder now, the control in his tone replaced with something closer to demand, and a few heads turned, a few more phones lifted, the quiet observation becoming something else, something documented, something that could not be contained, and Vanessa stepped slightly back this time, not retreating but recalibrating, her eyes scanning the room, the people. The attention shifting away from control and toward consequence, and inside the room none of that entered, none of that mattered, because the space had narrowed to Emily, to the monitor, to the precise movements of the medical team, to the presence of Dr. Carter standing at her side with a focus that no longer belonged only to his role, and as he reached to guide the process forward, his expression remained composed. But his voice carried a final layer now, something firm, something resolved. Something that had moved beyond doubt into certainty. "We move now," he said, and the room responded instantly, every motion aligning, every second accounted for, and in that exact moment, as everything shifted from preparation into action, the truth that had been building quietly beneath the surface reached the edge of being seen, of being spoken, of changing everything that came next. Everything moved at once, but nothing felt rushed, the kind of controlled acceleration that only happened when every second mattered and every person in the room understood their role without needing it repeated, and Emily felt herself being guided further into position, the nurse's voice close to her ear, steady, counting softly, reminding her when to breathe, when to hold, when to let go. While the monitor marked each shift with precision, the rhythm no longer a background sound but the center of everything, and she followed it, not perfectly, not without strain, but with determination that had replaced fear, because fear had no space left in this moment, only focus, only survival, only the quiet promise she had made without words to protect what was still unseen but undeniably present, and beside her Dr. Carter remained unwavering. His attention split with exact balance between the data on the screen and the person in front of him, his voice low but firm as he guided the process forward. "Stay with it, you are exactly where you need to be." And Emily nodded faintly, her eyes closing briefly as another wave moved through her, stronger, deeper, pulling everything inward, while outside the room the tension had reached its breaking point, David's voice rising again, no longer controlled, no longer measured. "I am not going to stand here and be ignored," he said, and this time the words carried beyond the doorway, drawing attention from further down the corridor, footsteps slowing, conversation stopping, the moment expanding outward as more witnesses became part of it, and Vanessa shifted again, her composure thinning at the edges, her eyes scanning the growing audience, calculating the shift from private control to public exposure, and that was when a security officer appeared at the end of the hall, not moving quickly but with purpose, drawn by the change in tone, the escalation that no longer fit within quiet observation. And inside the room none of that entered, none of it mattered because the space had narrowed completely to the present second, to the next instruction, to the next breath, and Dr. Carter's focus did not waver, but something within him had fully settled now, no longer forming, no longer questioning, but certain, and he reached once more toward Emily's wrist, not to check, not to confirm, but instinctively, as if grounding himself in the reality of what he already knew, the bracelet catching the light again. The name clear, Carter, and this time he did not look away from it. Immediately, because the truth had reached the point where silence was no longer neutral, where holding it back was no longer possible, and he lifted his gaze not to the nurse, not to the monitor, but to Emily, his expression still composed but carrying something new beneath it, something that had crossed from realization into responsibility, and he spoke, his voice still steady but unmistakably different. "Emily," he said, using her name with a weight that had not been there before. "You are safe here." And the words landed with quiet force, because safety was no longer just a condition of the room, it was a promise, and outside the door the corridor had shifted completely, no longer passive, no longer silent, the presence of authority moving closer, the situation no longer contained, and as the room continued forward, as the process reached its peak, the truth that had been building beneath every second, every glance, every detail, stood on the edge of being spoken, ready to change not just the moment, but everything that would follow. The moment did not explode, it crystallized, everything narrowing into a single point where time felt suspended and inevitable at once, and Emily felt it in the way her breath locked for a fraction of a second before releasing, in the way her body followed through with something she could no longer control but had fully committed to, her focus absolute, her strength drawn from somewhere deeper than fear. While the monitor beside her responded with sharp, precise signals that filled the room with urgency, and the nurse's voice guided her through it, steady, counting, grounding, while Dr. Carter stood at her side, his presence no longer just professional, no longer just controlled, but anchored in something far more personal that had finally reached the surface. And as the room moved in perfect coordination, as the process reached its peak and then began to shift toward resolution, he did not look at the monitor. He looked at Emily, because the truth that had been building through every second, every glance, every detail, had reached the point where it could no longer remain unspoken, and he said it, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. "Emily Carter." His voice steady, firm, undeniable. "I have been searching for that name for over 20 years. And for a brief second the room did not stop, but it changed, the air itself shifting as the words landed, because they did not belong to the moment they were spoken in, they belonged to something older, something unfinished, something that had just found its way back, and Emily's eyes opened, not fully understanding, not yet, but feeling the weight in his voice, the difference, the shift from doctor to something else entirely, and he continued, not stepping away from his role, not losing control, but allowing the truth to exist alongside it. "You were listed as a missing child, no records, no family trace, only a name that never matched any file." And his jaw tightened slightly, the only sign of the years behind those words. "And I never closed that case." And the nurse glanced up for just a second, the words registering even as her hands continued their work, because this was no longer just a medical moment, it was something intersecting past and present in real time, and outside the room the corridor had reached its own breaking point, the presence of security now firm, voices lowered but tense, David's authority dissolving under the weight of something he could not control, something he did not understand, and Vanessa's silence deepened, her composure no longer intact, her calculations no longer holding. Because the situation had moved beyond influence into consequence, and inside the room Emily's breathing steadied again, not because the pressure had disappeared, but because something else had entered, something unexpected, something that shifted her from isolation into connection, even if she could not yet define it, and Dr. Carter leaned slightly closer, his voice quieter now, but carrying the full weight of what he knew, what he had just confirmed beyond doubt. "You are not just my patient," he said, each word precise, deliberate, irreversible. "You are my daughter." And the truth settled into the room without sound, without force, but with a permanence that changed everything in an instant, because some revelations do not need volume to reshape the world, they only need to be true. The words did not echo, they settled, quiet and absolute, as if the room itself understood that nothing louder was needed, and for a fraction of a second everything continued as it had been, the monitor still marking its rhythm, the nurse still guiding Emily through the final sequence, the controlled movement of a process that could not pause even for truth, and yet beneath that motion something had shifted permanently. Something that could not be undone, and Emily felt it not as understanding. Not yet, but as a change in the way the space around her held, the way the voice beside her carried something more than instruction, more than reassurance, something that reached deeper, steadier, and she did not speak, she did not question, because there was no room left for anything except the moment she was still moving through, and Dr. Carter did not repeat himself, did not explain. Because he understood that some truths did not need to be processed immediately to be real, they only needed to be present, and he remained exactly where he was, his focus unbroken, his voice steady as he guided her through the final steps, each instruction precise, each second accounted for, and then the rhythm shifted. Not abruptly, but decisively, the kind of shift that signaled transition, that marked the crossing from uncertainty into outcome, and the nurse's tone changed just slightly, a note of relief entering beneath the control. "That is it, stay with me," she said, and Emily followed, her breath catching once more before releasing, her body completing what it had begun, and in that moment the tension that had filled the room did not disappear, it transformed, moving from urgency into something quieter. Something resolved, while outside the doorway the corridor had reached a different kind of stillness, not charged, not escalating, but watching, because the presence of security had settled the space, had redirected the energy, and David no longer spoke, not because he had accepted anything, but because the moment had moved beyond him entirely, his influence replaced by structure, by protocol, by consequence that was no longer optional, and Vanessa stood beside him without speaking, her composure gone, her attention fixed on the room she could no longer enter, and inside, as the final movement settled, as the monitor adjusted to a new rhythm, Dr. Carter allowed himself one brief pause, not in action, but in acknowledgement, his gaze moving to Emily again, not as a doctor assessing a patient, but as a father seeing what had been lost and found at the same time. And he did not reach for her in a way that would break the moment, he did not disrupt the space she was still in, but his voice softened just slightly, carrying something that did not belong to medicine alone. "You did not face this alone," he said quietly, and the words held a weight that extended beyond the room, beyond the moment, beyond everything that had led to it, and Emily's eyes opened slowly, her breath steadier now, her body no longer fighting but recovering, and she looked at him, not fully understanding, not yet ready to, but recognizing something undeniable in the way he stood there, in the way he had stayed, in the way he had chosen her without hesitation, and outside the room the world had already begun to adjust, the attention shifting, the story forming, the consequences beginning to unfold, but inside, in that contained space where everything had just changed, there was only a quiet, irreversible truth settling into place, and the understanding that some men lose control in a moment, while others find what they were meant to protect. The room did not return to normal, it settled into something quieter, something steadier, the kind of calm that only comes after everything has already changed, and Emily lay back against the raised bed, her breathing slower now, deeper, no longer pulled tight by urgency but guided by recovery, her hand still resting protectively where it had been all along, not out of fear anymore, but out of instinct, out of connection. And the monitor beside her reflected that shift, its rhythm smoothing, its sharp edges softening into something sustainable, while the nurse adjusted the equipment with practiced efficiency, her movements lighter now, the tension in her shoulders released just enough to signal that the critical moment had passed, and she offered a small nod, more to the room than to anyone in particular, the silent confirmation that everything had moved from risk into stability. And beside the bed Dr. Carter remained where he was, not stepping away, not turning his attention elsewhere, his presence grounded, deliberate, as if leaving now would break something that had only just begun to hold, and he looked at Emily, not with urgency, not with analysis, but with a quiet recognition that carried years behind it, years of unanswered questions, years of absence that had never been resolved, and he did not rush to fill the space with explanation, he allowed the silence to exist. Because some moments required space more than words, and Emily looked back at him, her eyes clearer now, searching, not fully understanding, but no longer uncertain that something real had been spoken, something that connected her to a past she had never been given the chance to know, and she did not ask yet, because even without details, even without proof, there was something in the way he had stood beside her, something in the way he had chosen her without hesitation, that felt undeniable. And outside the room the corridor had transformed completely, no longer tense but active. Voices lower but purposeful, the presence of authority no longer a question but a fact, and David stood further back now, not by choice but by circumstance, his posture rigid, his expression tightened into something unfamiliar, not control, not confidence, but the realization that the moment had moved beyond his reach, beyond his influence, beyond anything he could correct or contain, and Vanessa remained beside him, but her distance had grown, subtle but clear, her attention no longer aligned with his, her calculations shifting towards self-preservation as the weight of what had been witnessed, what had been recorded, what could no longer be denied, began to settle into consequence, and inside the room Dr. Carter finally spoke again, his voice quiet, steady. Not as a doctor giving instruction, but as something else entirely, something that did not need to define itself to be understood. "We will take this one step at a time," he said, and the words carried both patience and promise, and Emily nodded slowly, not because she had all the answers, but because for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing at the edge of everything alone, and the space between them held that understanding without needing to explain it, while the world outside continued to shift, to react, to move forward into consequences that would unfold long after this moment ended, and as the room settled fully into its new rhythm, into its new reality, one truth remained quiet but permanent, that some men lose everything they try to control, and only then realize what they never truly owned.